Simon was on. He seems to have dropped off. I do apologise. Please bear with me one moment, and hopefully Simon will be back on soon.
Thank you, Lisa, and to the UK Cybersecurity Association for hosting today. It's a real pleasure and an honour to be able to talk to you this morning. As Lisa introduced me, Simon Newman, I'm Head of Cyber and Business Services for an organisation called Police Crime Prevention Initiatives. Within that, I look after the Police Digital Security Centre. The focus of the talk this morning, very much as the title says, is talk about some of the challenges that governments face, not just here in the UK, but I guess it's an international perspective as well, and to talk about some of the trends that we've seen perhaps over the past few years in terms of what individuals and businesses are facing in terms of their cybercrime. So I want to just very briefly start talking about what we do at PDSC. We were established in London back in 2015 by the Mayor of London, really to help those micro and small businesses raise their awareness about the importance of good cybersecurity, and recognizing really that many of the things that they should be doing are either very cheap or free to implement that can protect them from the overwhelming majority of cybercrime that we see. We're just in the middle of a 2-year program of work with the Metropolitan Police, working across all London boroughs together with the London Growth Hub, and we're delivering advice, workshops, and working with individual police officers to go and visit businesses at their place of work and talk to them about how they can reduce their cyber vulnerability. It's been a really interesting exercise for us so far, and we do that through producing a series of webinars, infographics like you see in front of us here, which are pulled together with the hope of just improving the security posture of those most vulnerable organisations. We also work with a large number of vendors, and we are constantly always looking for new material and new information that we can push out through our media partners. And this is just some of the 150 plus articles that we've had published in the last year on a range of cybersecurity issues. Of course, many of those have been around COVID, but many also some of those emerging issues, particularly things around ransomware and the importance of cyber insurance as it grows in a maturing marketplace. So to start off, really, I wanted to share this slide with you, which is some figures that have been taken from the crime survey for England and Wales. This is generally regarded as one of the most reliable indicators of crime across the country. It's based on people's experiences of crime as opposed to what's been recorded by individual police forces. And the reason that that's considered more accurate, of course, is not everyone goes on to report the fact that they've been a victim of crime. Now, this is 2019 to 2020. There are some more recent figures available, but because of the pandemic and the fact that we were in lockdown for the last 12 months or so, I felt it probably most reliable to use these figures. And they haven't changed according to the methodology massively in the last 12 months. But again, it just gives a very good indication of the nature and scale of what we're seeing across England and Wales. So I'll start off on the left-hand side first of all. Now, this first column, 10.2 million, that in fact is the total number of incidents of crime across the whole of England and Wales. So that's everything, whether it be cybercrime, fraud, burglary, robbery, theft, including murder and all other offences as well. That's everything, and that gives you a true nature over a 12-month period of what happens in England and Wales. So then if we take those figures and we look at them in a bit more detail, we come to the figure of 4.5 million. Now, 4.5 million relates specifically to the number of incidents of cybercrime and fraud together. So this is across just England and Wales. Scotland has its own way of recording its figures. So that represents about 45%. So it's quite an alarming figure. So straight away, you can see that almost half of all crime in England and Wales is fraud or cyber related. Pretty big number. And you can see the trend of this is where we're heading down. So again, if we look at those figures and we strip out the fraud element, we're looking at roughly around 900,000 cybercrime incidents a year in any given 12-month period. And that represents about 9% of the total. So it's still a fairly large number. But in terms of what gets reported, and you'll start seeing at the moment in terms of what that looks like. But about 900,000 to £1 million is around about the ballpark figure. And it seems to have hovered around that figure for the last few years. So then we start going down a little bit further. And we look at this figure here of 338,000. So these are the total number of fraud and cybercrime offences recorded by Action Fraud. So of those 4.5 million offences, only 338,000 actually get captured is not there to investigate. It's simply a body that is there to capture and record incidents before passing them on to relevant bodies, including some local police forces. But straight away, we're starting to see a significant reduction. And one of the questions that we're often asked is, why is there such a shortage or such a small number of those incidents that go on to be reported? And there are a number of reasons for it. Some people may not consider that they've been a victim of a crime. Some may not feel that it's necessary or appropriate. Some may feel that the police aren't going to be able to do anything to it, particularly in relation to cybercrime and fraud, where it's often very difficult to bring the offender to justice. Some, there may be reputational images, particularly for a business. Some may be embarrassed, things like sexual harassment cases and dating scams that we hear about in the news quite regularly. But that's quite a worrying trend for us. And in terms of percentages, that's just 7%. So our reporting or recording rate is just 7% of those offences, which is a big, big gap. Some of the figures that I put up there come from action fraud figures. Again, the percentage increases are quite high because the numbers are quite low. But we can see some big rises over the past 12 months or so in things like hacking, of social media accounts, and of course of emails, and also an increase in computer viruses and malware, specifically things like ransomware. And it'll be interesting to monitor how those things develop over the next few years as well. So then let's go down a little bit further. So we go down to this figure of 26,215. And again, that's stripping out all of the fraud-related offences and focusing purely on cybercrime. So action fraud only recorded 26,000 incidents of cybercrime in that 12-month period. So that's 3%. So we're only hearing about 3% of crimes that are taking place. 26,000 is a tiny, tiny number. And then we go down to this number. Now, can anyone guess what this number is? Well, 65 is, as far as we're aware, the total number of convictions for cybercrime in England and Wales. So out of all of those offences, we are led to believe that we're somewhere in the region of around about 60 to 65 convictions. I was reading a statistic the other day and trying to look through some figures, and it appeared that around about 1/3 of those are actually police officers. Now, that's of course not to say police officers are committing cybercrime, but it may be due to computer misuse offences as a result of accessing things like the police national computer or police national database inappropriately. What does that look like as a conviction rate? Pretty worrying, 0.007%. So that's effectively what we're looking at in terms of cybercrime in England and Wales. So we have a huge volume of incidents, very few get reported, very few get recorded, and then of course very few then end up in prosecutions and convictions. And you'll see as I work through my presentation, the focus very much is on prevention. I also wanted to reference another document that you may well have come across. Each year, the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport produce a document called the Cyber Breaches Survey. The latest one was produced in March 20. Figures, I think, that come out of that survey, which again are worth sharing. Now, the sample sizes are relatively small, but what they try and do is cover organisations of all sizes, from micro businesses right up to large corporate organisations in excess of 500 or so staff. And they also include a separate element where they look at charities, who we also know are very vulnerable to cybercrime and are targeted by cyber criminals because of the information and the value of that information that they hold. Perhaps the big headline figure in the middle there, 39%, is that about 39% of all businesses suffer at least one attack or a breach in a given 12-month period. So very similar to individuals, but still quite a worrying figures. Interesting enough, if you look at on the top right-hand side, about 83% say phishing was the most common source of attack. And despite all the information, the advice, the warning, the advice and infographics and other things that we do, including training as well, phishing still seems to be a very, very effective tool used by cyber criminals to target these organizations. But not everyone loses money or has a negative outcome. And I think that's important to mention. Other things there which are quite interesting, and I've pulled some few statistics which I thought were really important. On the left-hand side, we talk about bring your own devices, BYOD. Still an alarming number of organisations, particularly those micro and small businesses, who allow their staff to bring their own devices to work and plug them into their own networks, whether it's for charging their phones or for downloading files, etc. It's a really big risk, and we simply don't know what's on those devices and the risk that they pose to organisations. Alarmingly, lots of organisations still running outdated versions of operating systems, perhaps more of a problem or an issue with larger organisations, but again, we're making it easier for those criminals in what we see. I think the other two things I wanted to pick out there was one around where organisations go to seek information. So a large number of the majority of organizations certainly go outside their own organization to seek advice. They look at private sector organizations, they look at perhaps public sector as well in terms of government, but only a very small number, fewer than 1%, actually turn to the National Cybersecurity Centre, which I find really bizarre. The NCSC, of course, are the national body responsible for cyber across the whole of the UK. Their information is pushed out very far and wide. It's very accessible, it's very well written, and it's often displayed in a format that can be easily understood by a range of organisations and people. Yet very few people actually turn to them for advice, which I think is a worrying trend. And the last thing I just wanted to pull up on this slide is around, of course, cyber insurance. We've been working very closely with cyber insurers over the past year or so, looking at how we can work with insurers to just provide that extra level of protection to organisations. And it's been really fascinating to see the comparisons between where we are in the UK and perhaps other countries, and particularly in the US, where there are more mature market in terms of insurance. And around about 35 to 40% of businesses have cyber insurance. We're not there yet, we're getting there. And there's a lot of work that's going on with the insurance industry and government to try and increase that level as a way of helping, but ensure they've got those measures in place to reduce their vulnerability in the first place as well. So there's just some statistics, and I've got another slide later on, which is some of the work we've been doing and the findings that we've been having as well. So we'll talk about the challenges that we face across law enforcement in terms of the problems created by cybercrime. And I've listed 8 core challenges, which I think are relevant in any country. The first of those is around the age of the offender. What we've seen as evidence from Europol recently suggests that the average age of a cyber criminal is around about 17 years old. And that poses a huge challenge for us from a criminal justice perspective. On the one hand, they're committing arguably what are quite serious offences, which